Hello. Good evening, and welcome to the Museum of the City of New York. I'm Sarah Seidman, the Puffin Foundation Curator of Social Activism here at the museum and curator of Activist New York, exhibition on the second floor. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's conversation, Puerto Rican activism from New York to San Juan and beyond. This program accompanies Activist New York, which is an ongoing exhibition that explores histories of activism in New York City from the 1600s through today, through a series of rotating case studies. In particular, I wanted to highlight the exhibition section installed last year on the Young Lords, which had their headquarters here in East Harlem, we installed it on the occasion of their 50th anniversary in 2019, and to thank those of you who are here tonight on stage and in the audience who participated and collaborated and shared their work and ideas around that content. If you haven't seen it yet, we encourage you to come back anytime during regular museum hours, 10 to 6 every day, and to keep this conversation going tonight and into the future. This evening, we are honored to be joined by Johanna Fernández, author of the recently published Young Lords, A Radical History. Activist, organizer, and researcher Pablo Benson-Silva. Filmmaker, writer, and scholar Frances Negrón-Muntaner. And former Young Lord Mickey Melendez. And we'll hear a little bit more about them in a moment. Together, they'll sit down for a conversation moderated by the Museum of the City of New York's own Andrew W. Mellon Foundation Post-Doctoral Fellow, Monxo López, about the diasporic activism between Puerto Rico and New York City, using the Young Lords as one lens, but also connecting past and present, as we love to do here at the museum. Following tonight's conversation, Johanna's book, Young Lords, A Radical History, will be available for purchase and signing by Johanna in the back of the auditorium. Before we begin, I'd like to take this moment to thank the Puffin Foundation, whose support makes our Activist New York exhibition and programs possible. And looking ahead, I'd like to invite you to come back to the museum for a program on the Harlem Renaissance, The New Negro, The Life of Elaine Locke, on Tuesday, March 24th at 6:30, where we'll welcome author and professor Jeffrey Stewart as he discusses his Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Locke, the father of the Harlem Renaissance, and then in conversation with Harlem-style intellectual Lana Turner. You can find more about it on our website, mcny.org/coreconvo. Now I'll ask you to silence anything that buzzes or beeps, but encourage you to tweet using the hashtags MCNYLive or ActivistNY. And okay, now I'm going to give slightly longer introductions for our speakers, but please note that everyone has a full bio highlighting more of their amazing work in the print program. So, Pablo Benson-Silva is an activist, organizer, and researcher born and raised in San Juan, Puerto Rico, that moved to New York City more than 14 years ago. He's been involved in many projects that span Occupy Wall Street, the Puerto Rican Mutual Aid Network, Fearless Cities, and the Worker Cooperative Movement. Johanna Fernández teaches in the Department of History at Baruch College at CUNY. She's the author of Young Lords, A Radical History, and other works, and co-curated the multi-venue exhibition Presente, The Young Lords in New York in 2015. Miguel Mickey Melendez is the author of We Took the Streets, about his experience in the Young Lords Party. He also has a master's degree in public administration and works with the city's Department of Education. As a former Young Lord, he remains a committed activist for Puerto Rican rights. Frances Negrón-Muntaner is a filmmaker, writer, scholar, and professor at Columbia University, where she's also the founding curator of the Latino Arts and Activism Archive, and she's the author of many books and films, and in 2019 launched the award-winning Valor y Cambio, an art, digital storytelling, and just economy project in Puerto Rico, which I know we'll hear more about tonight. And then finally, our moderator, Monxo López, is a researcher, educator, cartographer, and South Bronx-based urban activist. He's currently the Mellon Foundation Fellow here at the museum, and he holds a PhD in political science from CUNY's Graduate Center, grew up in Puerto Rico, and currently lives in Mott Haven, the South Bronx. We feel so honored to have these distinguished guests with us here tonight. Won't you please join me in welcoming them? Thank you.
Hello. So my name is Monxo, and as a brief thematic introduction, I have two things to say. The first one is that I really urge you to run and buy and read Johanna's book, okay? It is a work of erudition. It's a beautiful book. It's beautifully written. It's a gripping narrative that at times feels, movie-like in its immersion. And so I want to thank Johanna for such a beautiful work. As Pablo was joking, like we've been waiting for this book from before the Young Lords, existed, and so but like it was really worth the wait, and I really want to thank Johanna for such a beautiful and important work. Okay, so that's number one, and you can get it signed. So. As Sarah was saying, the most immediate context for this conversation, it's Johanna's book. It's also the fact that we have here the Activism New York exhibit. Are you hearing me well? Yes. Okay. So, like this. Feels like, Frank Sinatra. So the fact that we have the Activism New York exhibit here that has a section about the Young Lords curated by Sarah, but the conversation tonight is not going to be about Johanna's book, although it's going to have the book at its center. I feel that it would be odd to talk about the Lord's economic restructuring, colonialism, urban crisis, environmental racism in the 1960s and 70s, which were part of the issues that the Lords were dealing with, without talking about how these issues are still pummeling our communities today. And so that's why I think that we all agree that we need to bring the conversation into the present. So the current context is, as many of you might know, an acute crisis of legitimacy in Puerto Rico's colonial government, a crisis of legitimacy also in the colonial pact at the base of the Puerto Rico-U.S. relation of dependency. The context is also a rapidly racist and intolerant regime here in the continental U.S., a fiscal crisis that it's around a decade old by now. The context is also hurricanes Irma and Maria, a forced migration that has made part of the island feel empty, like what Frances will call la isla que se vacía, the emptying island. We have a crisis here that is part of the context of urban hyper-speculation in real estate, gentrification, displacement, cultural erasure, police brutality and unaccountability, and incarceration here in the city. Los temblores, the earthquake in Puerto Rico, an unelected junta that is in fact governing the island, and an environmental racism crisis, global warming that threatens us all, but that threatens most especially low-income communities of color, like the Lower East Side, El Barrio, Loíza, El Caño Martín Peña, and the South Bronx. But the current context is also an energized pro-immigration rights opposition here. The unseating of an incompetent Nene de Papi Guaynabito governor over there in Puerto Rico. An anti-carceral state abolitionist movement here. Fideicomisos and community land trusts flourishing here and there. Activists fighting for the rights of unhoused people here in New York City, the occupations of schools and public buildings in Puerto Rico, anti-displacement and anti-gentrification activism here in the city, a fight to demilitarize our subway system, a struggle for police accountability in Puerto Rico, efforts for food and energy independence in the island as well, a social currency project that Frances is working on, both here and there, and the flourishing of community-based environmental justice groups, some of them like my comrades in South Bronx Unite in the South Bronx, struggling at times over the very same buildings that the Panthers and the Young Lords fought over many, many years ago. In short, the context is reaction and resistance. And so my first question, the way that we're gonna do this is gonna be, I'm gonna be doing a few things at the same time. So the way that this is supposed to happen is that I'm gonna ask these people a question, and they will have 4 to 5 minutes to answer, which we'll know that it's likely not gonna happen. And so while they're doing that, I'm gonna be clicking here on the slides, and then we'll go through a second round of questions, and then you'll have the chance to ask them questions at the end, okay? So my first question will be to Johanna, of course, like she wrote the book that brought us here. So Johanna, can you tell us 3 or 4 things about the Lords that you think we should know about them that we probably shouldn't? In other words, why should we read almost 400 words about of pages, 400 pages about the Young Lords, and why should we care about them 50 years after the fact?
Okay, first of all, that's impossible to do, but I'm going to try it.
Okay.
And I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight. It's rainy, it's cold. I was taking a nap before I got here, and I was like, should I go? But here we are. And thank you, Monxo, for that wonderful introduction to the book. And Monxo has been sending me little texts while he's been reading the book, and they're everything. They make me happy, and my biggest honor is that folks actually read the 400 and some odd pages. The Young Lords is, in my humble opinion, single-handedly the most important organization of the New Left. And the New Left is the cohort of young people who led the movements of the 1960s. And the New Left is important because the New Left transformed the relationship between white people and black people in particular, and people of color in general in the United States. They transformed the way we understand gender and sexuality, and they made acceptable critiques of US foreign policy. There wasn't a revolution in the 1960s, but there was definitely a revolution in the way we live and we think that was produced by these movements. And the Young Lords is the least but most effective and most badass organization of the 60s. When we think about the socialist tradition, for example, in the United States, it's so difficult to like give it. I never talk sitting down. I'll sit because I don't want to go outside of the, I don't want to be a Young Lord. So I'm gonna stick to discipline. So when we think about the socialist tradition in the United States, we don't think about Puerto Ricans, and we definitely don't think about young people of color. And yet, in the 1960s, a group of Puerto Ricans and other people of color, because the Young Lords is incredible, in part because it was one of the most ethnically diverse organizations of the 60s. It was a Puerto Rican revolutionary nationalist organization, but 30% of its membership, between 30 and 35, were African Americans and other Latinos. So when we think of the socialist tradition, we think of the white left. But the Young Lords were socialist, anti-capitalist. They had freedom dreams of a different world. They had a structural critique of all of the problems that you've identified: environmental racism, the urban crisis, deindustrialization. They did an enormous amount of work around health. They are responsible for the passage, they're credited with the passage of anti-lead poisoning legislation in New York City. They drafted at Lincoln Hospital the first known patient Bill of Rights. They were among the first to theorize in the public square Puerto Rican racism and the ways in which race ideology developed in Latin America under colonial rule and U.S. imperialism versus how it developed here in the United States under British colonial rule. So, and what's important about the Young Lords is that when we think about the 60s, we think narrowly, especially when people of color are involved, we think narrowly about civil rights. But the Young Lords were fighting for civil rights in the community. They were raising issues of social and economic import, class issues like garbage, right, and why people in East Harlem and the Bronx don't get regular garbage collection. The healthcare crisis of epic proportion of that epoch. But one of the things that I argue in the book and I try to illustrate is that the Young Lords are significant because they were community organizers. They were trying to build a movement, but they were also trying to build a revolutionary organization. That is a rare thing. When you look at the left, folks are building a revolutionary organization that's usually disconnected from community. If you look at the history, with few exceptions, as in the example of the Communist Party in Harlem in the 1930s, on very few occasions have socialists successfully been community organizers, movement builders, and revolutionary socialists who are popularizing a critique of capitalism and a different way of ordering society among the people, right? And how did they do that? I think that their position, their positionality, if you will, their objective situation as migrants, as people who spoke two languages, who stood between two cultures, who helped their parents figure out the new society into which they had migrated. That gave the Young Lords as children a profound incisiveness and knowing about how the system works. Instinctively, and that's one of the arguments I make in this section that I titled the Migrant's Crucible. Because they were the ones who were taken by their parents to the hospital, to the precinct, to the welfare office, to the schools to translate. And at a very young age, they understood who they were, but that they were depicted differently, that they were lesser than, treated as such by these institutions. And in the context of the radicalization of the 1960s, they took that organic knowing and transformed it into a phenomenal revolutionary project in the streets, in their neighborhoods, in their schools, in the hospitals. The Young Lords were so many things, and I'm gonna end in a minute. So if you think about it, and I'm still trying to figure this out after 400 and some odd pages, think about what the Young Lords were. They were a gang first in Chicago. And and they were a gang, by the way, that was politicized and that made common cause with the Black Panther Party. And one of the things I argue in the book is that only a gang that was devoid of any middle-class respectability would have had the chutzpah to side with the most demeaned, the baddest, the most demonized radicals in the 60s, the Black Panthers. But because a gang, a Puerto Rican and Mexican gang in Chicago did that, we know the Young Lords today. Because the Black Panthers were the most iconic group of one of the most iconic groups of the 60s. So they were a gang. They were also social service do-gooders, right? They were a revolutionary organization. I was thinking about this today, and I just want to read the many things that they were. They were a gang, they were community organizers, they were social service do-gooders, and they also engaged in militant direct action in the streets. Few organizations in the United States and its history do all of those things. You're either a social service organization, or you do direct action, and only that, or you organize in the community, and you're definitely not a gang, and all of those things, and a revolutionary organization. I can go on and on and on, but the work that the Young Lords did door to door around health, and the muckraking they did in the streets, the direct action, the garbage dumping, it established a sense in the city for the first time among the most demeaned working class of this town. 70% of Puerto Ricans worked in the what's the name of the industry? In the garment industry. This is the super exploited class of the city, whose dignity was stripped by the media and politicians. They were demeaned as criminals on the one hand, but also considered mild-mannered people on the other. And so when the Young Lords came into the scene, occupied a church, took over a hospital, it transformed the perception that this city had of Puerto Ricans, and it sent the message that you're not going to be able to mess with these people. And among many other things, the Young Lords just fought for the highest aspirations of humanity and amplified the presence and the profile of the United States colonial project in Puerto Rico. And we thank them and we owe them, especially Latinos who've come after, among them Dominicans. I'm of Dominican ancestry. We owe the Young Lords and their struggles tremendously for opening up the path to freedom for the rest of us. Thank you.
Monxo, I don't know if you're coming back to that question, but I want to add one thing of what they were. And one of the reasons I think we're still talking about them, which is they were brilliant storytellers.
Absolutely.
Mickey, I'm going to throw you under the bus immediately. We just met. O como dirían en Puerto Rico, te voy a tirar mondongo. Okay. So, in a conversation over the phone, you talked about the big mistake. And I could feel you. I don't know if it was pain, anger, boredom, frustration. One of the things that interests me, at least, is that bridge of tension and solidarity, of successes and missteps between the diaspora and the island. So can you talk a little bit about the so-called big mistake? What was that?
Yeah, and everything that you expressed, I was feeling. So first of all, what I like to do is welcome a number of people here, just a group of people here that come from our generation of struggle, Puerto Rican Student Union people and people from El Comité that are here, which are right on the streets. When we were on the east side, they were kind of on the west side, and the members of the Puerto Rican Student Union that were the student arm of the Young Lords. The big mistake, I think that there were actually two big mistakes that happened, and they happened close by to each other. One was the taking over of the front of the parade, which probably was seen as young bravado going up against New York City Police Department with nunchakas and marbles. The marbles were for the horses so that the horses can trip, so we thought. So that was a real big mistake because, I mean, number one, by that time, we had developed our political philosophy, our commitments with each other as an organization. But what happened with that was that if you make that commitment for yourself and you're ready to put your life on the line, it doesn't mean that you extend that to a community. And basically what taking over the front of the parade did was basically allowed the New York City Police Department to just beat people indiscriminately. Yeah, there were a lot of young lords, but then they just went through the crowds. And we were responsible for that, and we felt the blowback, the following weeks, the doñas that used to bring us food to our offices, stopped coming. So we really felt that we had lost something. We didn't realize it at the time, and it's a lot easier retrospectively to look at these things and look at them real deeply and see the mistakes that we did. The one mistake, the other mistake that we did was shortly after that was, here we are, Northeast urban Latinos, born, raised, educated in the United States, first generation. So, we've had so much success here doing the takeovers and doing the health programs that we decided that we were going to go to Puerto Rico and take the revolution to Puerto Rico. Which, again, totally negating the history of the movement in Puerto Rico. Landing in Puerto Rico and selling Palante, our newspaper. And what language was Palante in? English. Right there in, La 65 Infanteria, trying to sell Palante with combat boots and army jackets as if it was winter. One of the things, though, that, so again, it was just, I don't know what to call it, probably, just New York, chauvinism. Again, I'm not sure what people were thinking or what we were thinking that we were going to do going there. And it was a real split in the organization. There was a real, conversations and discussions that went on. But one of the things that we did find when we went over there, we looked at a couple of things. And what we found was that the Puerto Rican left in Puerto Rico was mainly made up of white men and probably very middle class at that time. Talking about 60, 67, 68, 69, 70. And there were no women and no Afro-Boricuas in this movement. So those are the kind of conversations that we try to have with them. It didn't go very much because by that time we were basically realizing that this is not where we should be. It cost the organization, it drained the organization of valuable resources. The move at that time in '69 cost about $10,000 when you can get on a train for 10 or 15 cents, when a pack of cigarettes was between 15 and 20 cents. So just the scale of economy, you could see the impact on it. But I think it's also good to look at these things and learn from them. And I think that the recent struggles have really defined for many of us the role that the diaspora should play in supporting the issues and the struggles of Puerto Rico. We're here, we need to be here, we need to be loud, and we need to bring the issues of our community forward. Because again, it's like the blackout news. It's like how many people know that 85,000, Somalian children have died of starvation. You know, it's a news blackout that's going on, or what's going on in Yemen. But we're in a particular position here as Puerto Ricans to really bring that forward. So I think that that's very important. I think the other piece that's very important is about accepting the leadership that comes out of Puerto Rico, you know. And that's the best way that we can be supportive to the issues of Puerto Rico, whether it's around removing the governor, whether it's about exposing the ongoing corruption that happens in Puerto Rico, where probably, if not daily, weekly, if not weekly, monthly, something surfaces of somebody getting caught. You know, even hiding things from resources and life-saving resources that were stacked away from Maria. So again, it puts us in that position. But yeah, looking back, I think that there were very terrible mistakes, and I think that the way of looking back at history is analyzing it and figuring out what are the lessons of it, and figuring out how to do it better moving forward.
Pablo, I feel like Don Francisco. Sábado gigante. So Pablo, you are the real baby here. We all look young and fabulous, but you know you're the real baby here. And so you've been involved in all these different movements. And we're going to talk about movements later. Occupy Wall Street and the workers' co-ops, and supporting from here, from the diaspora, the revolt in Puerto Rico during the summer, or your social media organizing, the fight against Promesa, and so on and so forth. You're gonna get arrested right after we leave here. I'm itemizing, you know, the list. And so, do you see here and there in Puerto Rico, here, do you still, can you see the influence of the Lords in that kind of revolts and offensive resistance that we've been seeing of late in Puerto Rico? And also, I know that you've read some of Johanna's book. Based on that big mistake that Mickey talked about just now, have you seen a realignment of the diaspora activist community in Puerto Rico relationship?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, precisely. I'm going to start off with that last point. You know, like what happened this summer in Puerto Rico is remarkable. You know, we had, in less than 13 days, we deposed the governor with a reggaeton sound beat led by queer folks, with Perreo Combativo, right? Like with just this unleashing of creativity, a swarming of energy, of excitement, not just in Puerto Rico, but all across the diaspora, which I'm gonna show in a little bit. And on the heels of also a global wave of social movement energy. Like, let's remember what was happening this summer. It wasn't just in Puerto Rico, right? You know, this was like Hong Kong, Chile, afterwards, right? Like, we were in this social movement moment, right? And part of what like I've been working on, especially like one of the things that really changed my way of understanding and viewing the current landscape for organizing, for social movement organizing, was Occupy, was the experience of Occupy here in New York 9 years ago, and subsequent Occupy Sandy, which I think owes a lot to the Young Lords, right? That kind of prefigurative, like, let's start creating the world we want to see in the midst of a profound and deep crisis, right? In which the government is either not responding or responding too slowly, right? There's a concrete direct link between that experience, right? The Young Lords and like the activation of that kind of decentralized relief effort. And I think looking at Puerto Rico, the case of what happened in Maria and the diaspora's response to Maria, I was going to share with you like a map that we created, but no, it's not actually, no, not the map. You know, it was an instantaneous. You know, we're talking about hundreds of relief sites across the United States, across the world. in response to what was happening in Puerto Rico and taking the lead of self-organized groups and formations on the island or on the archipelago, right? And so that is a very different dynamic that I've seen in my lifetime, right? Like before Maria, like organizing across with Puerto Rico was extremely difficult, especially coming from the United States, right? Because you're learning, you're meeting all these connections, you're getting all this experience and working, you want to bring it back home. But if they're not leading, then there's an immediate wall, right, of resistance. And there's a lot of humility that came through, for me personally, through that experience of trying to organize. Today, it's a completely different landscape. And I'm going to show you. This right here is, this is the movement. This is the movement during the period of most activity on Twitter, right? So these are the hashtags of the movement. And as you can see, it looks like a heart, by the way. So this is called the network map. And basically, can you hit the next one more? I'm sorry. Go back. So you can't really see. I added one that was in more detail so you could actually see what's going on here. But basically what these are connections, are nodes of the Twitter handles that had the most retweets, and then the links are connections, who retweeted who. And what this map, this kind of visualization allows us to see is precisely the extent to which the diaspora, right, was important as an amplifier. Like this idea of the role, what is the role of the, so like if you can see right over here, this one on the, that point, the green point on the left, the top left, is AOC, right? And you can see that her network is outside of Puerto Rico. Like mainly, her followers are located outside of Puerto Rico. So she is an amplifier. She's literally, her mission, her role in this movement this summer was to amplify things for an outside audience. The most important connections are the ones that are more densely connected between each other, right? Because those are the ones who are actively, have the most overlapping relationships, what we call clusters in a network social movement. So what we had this summer was a distributed network social movement that so you go forward. So Occupy was more of a decentralized social movement. What we saw this summer was a distributed. It didn't really have a collective identity. It had like a hashtag, Ricky Renuncia, but there wasn't a thing that was like the Young Lords, right? There wasn't a collective identity, a strong ideological alignment, right? It was just a very diffuse thing, right? Which made it hard and difficult then for it to pivot to other things, which a lot of other things came out of that mass mobilization and politicization, rapid politicization, right? Of sectors that traditionally don't seem to be that involved in mobilizing, right, or political work, right? And so, for example, when the asambleas came afterwards, right, one of the difficulties was because there wasn't a collective identity, it was really hard to pivot that energy into those, even though those asambleas, localized assemblies, sprout up. Can you show the next slide, Monxo? This is a slide about the geolocated tweets during this period. You can see the blue is outside of Puerto Rico. The orange is in Puerto Rico. The yellow is unidentified. It's either people who geolocated, a place that doesn't exist, like hell or something like that. What you can see, though, here is that, and to be fair, Twitter was not the most important platform in the movement this summer, but it gives us a window into what was happening. The diaspora was incredibly important to what happened this summer, right? And can you show the next slide? And that participation is distributed. It's not just New York and Chicago anymore, right? Like we're seeing. This is just a map, right? So imposing the geolocation of the things. We're seeing. Look at Florida, right? Look at even California. Europe, even Europe's Latin America, heavily involved and invested in this movement. So we're seeing a decentralizing, we're seeing a trend, right, of like decentralizing the cities that used to be the primary hubs of Puerto Rican migration, right, as like the centers for the diaspora organizing, a kind of deprivileging of New York, and even though New York is still a super important node of Chicago, of these traditional hubs, right, and a much more distributed and deterritorialized diaspora, right, and that has both benefits and limitations, right, and that's something I can talk about later. But yeah. I just wanted to share a little bit about the kind of research that we do and help us like strategize the current moment. It's very different, right? Even though these mobilizations led to immense popular support, right? Very quickly, there are a lot of limitations around this new type of organizing. It's not the same as densely clustered, relational, right? As the Young Lords were. So media savvy, right, in respect to mass media attention, right, of doing actions and creative actions that were able to garner that mass media attention, right. Today, you can get rid of that. Today, you know, what we're seeing is a new kind of social movement that's added to that existing political landscape of the city, mass media, and now we have this new layer, right, of social media organizing. It's not that it displaces any of those before, right? It just adds a new level of a new terrain, expands our tactical repertoire, if you will. Okay? Yeah.
Frances,
Yes.
I'm going to ask you two questions because I think I'm not going to have time. We are not going to have time for the second round. And I've just decided, like, you know,
Go for
improv here, that maybe the best thing will be for you to ask questions of each other, if, you know, if you're game. So I'm going to ask you two questions. And I know that you're very organized, so I know that you're gonna. Okay, so the first one is that you wrote an article a few years ago, The Look of Sovereignty, in Centro Journal, no? About the Young Lord's capacity and skill in generating and or copying effective symbols as a part of their effort to forge their self-determination, this idea that our liberation was not going to be given freely by the people upstairs, but that we needed to forge it, to develop it ourselves. And so of all the people, and this might surprise you, but you know, I've been thinking about this for a while. So of all the artists and people that I know, I think that you are one of the artists that shows at times most clearly that influence of the Lords in terms of leveraging symbols and imagery in terms of the political arena. And so I wanted you to talk a little bit about the project that you've been recently involved, Valor y Cambio and Just Exchanges, in terms of the production of imagery and symbology as it relates to the economy in this particular case, because these efforts that you've been involved with are about social currencies. They started in Puerto Rico. Now we have the plan of bringing them in a way here. And so I wanted you to talk about that project a little bit. So that's number one. The other question that I had was that when you read Johanna's book, there is a part that she writes about los bembés that were going on in the church at night, you know, that they were doing all their political work and whatnot, and then in the evening, it was like, and you're like, wow, they were having fun, you know? And so I have a question, like, about the importance of joy, of happiness in revolution, and most seriously, if you think that the Young Lords will have supported el perreo combativo.
I do.
Yes, okay.
Absolutely.
All right. on the project, Valor y Cambio, it was interesting that I had not consciously thought about the project as a legacy of the Young Lords in some way until it was curated by Libertad Guerra and Yasmin Ramirez in a show called Art After the Young Lords. And that made me aware of the connection. As a scholar, I had written about the Young Lords, and particularly I wrote that piece that, let's go back to, and one of the things that I was, what I mentioned earlier about the storytelling capacity of the Young Lords, which I think is one of the reasons that we're still talking about them, and also that the Young Lords also attracted storytellers. There's an impressive visual record of the Young Lords, and it is not a mundane aesthetic. It is an epic aesthetic that tells a story, more than once, multiple stories, but that's an overarching story. So it caught my eye, and I guess I will get to your question, but it caught my eye the ways that the Young Lords brought forth a new body, like the ways that the body, the Puerto Rican collective and individual bodies walked after the Young Lords was different. And I was interested in seeing what were these ways that the body itself narrated the vision and the aspirations of this organization and the larger social movement that it belonged. So in this piece, I go through a number of those and the way they connoted other things, other spaces. So for instance, in the black and white photos, it's often difficult to see that the beret is purple. But the fact that it's purple goes back to the gang origins of the Young Lords, for instance. So it connotes a particular class genealogy. It also signifies gangs itself as arguably in some cases, political organizations. And then, of course, the jackets. And I spent a while, and I'll mention the Puerto Rico en mi corazón. Because a lot of the elements of the styles of the Young Lords were similar to the Black Panthers, some of them. But one way you could distinguish a Young Lord apart from the purple beret is the Tengo Puerto Rico en mi corazón. And of course, the Puerto Rican flag was another element of style that was brought out to distinguish themselves from others. So needless to say, I also was the person that wrote Jennifer's Butt, the first person to write about Jennifer Lopez's body as a contested site of signification and the movements and so forth. So I had been doing this work for a while. In what ways does bodies, more generally, connote these visions and perspectives? So to our project of Valor y Cambio, I didn't consciously hark back to this, but I think it was already part of the work that I had done. So basically what the project is, which since it's ongoing, I was part of a working group at Colombia called Unpayable Debt. We spent 2 years analyzing the Puerto Rico debt crisis in context of global debt crisis. And in that process, I realized a couple of things. And one of the things that I realized was that there is this notion called community currency, and that artists in many places in the world have been responsible for unleashing those community currencies in times of austerity and debt crisis. Another thing that I was thinking with this process is that in Ireland, after the crash of 2008, there was a government effort to engage the whole country in a conversation about what do we value as a community. So putting those three ideas together, this project was born. And it has three objectives. The first objective, and it began before the mass protest, was to provide a platform for Puerto Ricans to think about value. What do we value? And I can say in retrospect, because that we have thousands of recordings of people talking about what they value, that precisely the things that they value are the same things that the government is cutting. So to have this platform for people to engage and speak out loud, what do I value and what do we value, was one of the objectives. And one of the things that came out of that is often people left the booth crying or very happy, and I will go back to that. The second goal was to introduce the notion of community currency, which is a kind of money that can be created by a community to satisfy their needs of exchange. And there are about 5,000 community currencies in circulation in the world. One of the most famous is in New York State. It's called Ithaca Hours, and it's a time bank. In Spain is the country that probably has the most. It has 300, close to 300 community currencies in operation. And the third goal of this project was to create an experience where people could use this currency to see how it felt to have an economy that was not based on exploitation, extraction, and profit, but exchange. And in fact, what we created was an economy where storytelling was the unit of value. So how it worked is we took an ATM, we put a recorder in it, and we put a dispenser, and we put our currency. And people would go to the machine, and they had 3 minutes to talk about what they valued, how the community supported what they value, and if they knew anybody that did what they valued already. And in exchange of that, they got one of these bills. In the reverse of these bills, there's a QR code that you could use your phone to learn the story of those figures, families, and community. So in exchange for about 42 businesses accepting the currency, we promoted their story on the web. So everything that you obtained, let's say, in this process was the product of you exchanging a story with someone. So that was the project. When we got to Puerto Rico, we didn't know it was going to work. We had this 300 machine. We put it down in the first location, and what happened really surprised, and that's where the joy comes in. What happened was that hundreds of people came every day to the 8 sites that we had and did this project. And some people came every day. They wanted every bill. And some, and one of the things that caught my eye immediately as a result of just being there every day was that people would come out sometimes crying of joy. And when that happened again and again and again, I started asking people, why are you so happy? And I realized that what made people happy was a couple of things. One, that the currency and the project gave them the idea that change was in their hands. And that the figures and the stories that it told gave them the idea that a different present is possible. It also gave them the idea that we have had many challenges in the past. So if you think about the Cordero siblings teaching children out of their house, in a house that's still standing in El San Juan, where half the population of their neighborhood was enslaved. So we have seen a lot as a group. And that I called decolonial joy. And I've just been spending the last week finishing that piece of writing called decolonial joy, which is that moment where you can envision a different present. And I think that it might be the closest influence of the Young Lords in this work. Because the Young Lords were, precisely that was the point, seize the moment is now. And that things that look very daunting look less daunting when you actually move, act. Yeah, so.
So I feel like changing my mind again. Is the bravado of having a mic and being on a stage. I wanted to ask Johanna, in the coda of your book, you say, beware of movements. Are you talking about feeling the burn? Do you want me to vote Blumbito? What are you talking about?
That's fascinating. No, the Young Lords are a product of migration. They are the children of migration. And what I'm referring to a number of things. I'm referring to demographic shifts. A third of the people of the island of Puerto Rico landed in the U.S. mainland after World War II in the aftermath of Operation Bootstrap. What the United States never imagined was that the children, the American-born children of that migration, were going to challenge U.S. imperialism right here in the U.S. mainland. And I think that there has been, so I don't know if this is what you wanted me to, and then social movements. Social movements transform the way we live and what we dream and what we imagine, right? But I was thinking that NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, led to a massive transfer of people, much like we saw with the Puerto Rican migration. A third of the people, that's a dismembering of an island of sorts. And I think that what is fascinating about the Young Lords, and I don't know if others if other groups have actually accomplished this, was that the Young Lords put front and center the issue of diaspora at a moment when diasporas were flourishing everywhere in the world. And it didn't just talk about diaspora. It demanded to say, what does it mean for me to be Puerto Rican and American when I'm not really American, right? Who am I? What are we when we are massively displaced by poverty, by colonialism, to the metropole? And they were really the first to. That's a movement. That's a massive movement. And I mean, there's more of a Puerto Rican diaspora now than there has ever been. So I mean, that makes me think of what you've said about the significance of diaspora, especially on the internet. It helped amplify the catastrophe of epic proportion in Puerto Rico, such that now it seems that people around the world know about the island in ways that was never seen before.
I wanted to say something about like the big mistake. One of the most important things about the big mistakes is that we learn from it. And in that sense, I mean, in the Emptying Island, there are symptoms, there are things that people do now that signify a sense of diaspora that's unprecedented. For instance, in El Barrio Mariana, they occupied a school, Young Lords action, like style. They occupied a school, they transformed its function. And one of the things that the school does, it houses people from the diaspora that come work in El Barrio Mariana. So I want to say that I feel that's one important shift. And the second is that when 5.5 million Puerto Ricans live in the U.S. and 3.2 live in Puerto Rico, you're talking about a whole different landscape to think diaspora. And that's why I think you used the word archipelago at some point. That I think we're also perhaps ahead in it's a painful place to be ahead, but ahead in the sense that we might be producing a new form of relationship, political relationship, across certain boundaries that before were containing us. And that you could call an archipelagic politics.
It's taken over 40 years for the Young Lords to influence now Puerto Rican movement, social movement politics. But I think that these connections are like super clear. I mean, just both in terms of style, attitude, kind of radicalization. the Young Lords were such on the vanguard that Puerto Rican social movement activists weren't ready for them maybe in the 70s and 80s. But now there just seems to be a much more of a thirst for those models, for that. We're seeing it now. I mean, like, another important thing about what's happening that I just wanted to emphasize is that what this new landscape allows is a form of collaboration, participation from afar that didn't exist 30, 40 years ago, right? And so even though there's been this huge dislocation in the last 10 years, right, 10, 15 years of Puerto Ricans, another wave of Puerto Ricans moving, right, and emptying out the island, right? They're still involved in what's happening in Puerto Rico in a way that is like, there's no historical precedent for it, right? And so that changes how we need to think about how we organize, right? How we imagine together this community, right? Or imagine together liberation, right? And so, yeah, I'm just resonating.
This is why I critique the notion of my piece. It's called The Emptying Island, but I'm saying we shouldn't be calling it The Emptying Island because it's not an island.
Right. Exactly.
Okay. So now comes the moment in which you all have the opportunity to ask a few questions, because we have to be out of here at some point soon. And so I'm gonna politely ask you que no noten sermones and ask questions, okay? So, yeah, let's save the speeches. So how do we decide on this? I decide? No, not me. Because these people know me, and then I'm like, Monxo, Yes. Marina, yes.
Hi. So born and raised in East Harlem, a little too late to join your party, and a little too old at this point to run around with the folks that are doing it now. But resistance has been something that's happened throughout humanity. And we're seeing, it's not a re-spark, I don't see it, but Black Lives Matter, FTP, Take Back the Bronx, all of that stuff, people are doing things all over the country, all over the world, from a horizontal, bottom-up, leaderless model. And we're hearing the same things that we heard when you guys were in the streets, which is like, don't be so rude. That's not how you protest. That's not how you get things. And so what do you say to that?
Mickey, Marina, can you tell us what FTP stands for? Please. Okay, yes, Mickey. You said it, not me. Yes.
You know, and I don't want to be cliché, but one of the things that we always followed was that it was perfectly fine to break the rules for the greater good. That's why, when you talk about the body language, we were defiant, and I think our posture showed that. And the following generation was self-confident, which was, again, an extension, of that. So, I think that, I get this question often, do we need a Young Lords type of organization now? No. The answer is just no. We need to deal with the objective conditions that we're faced with. We then need to figure out how we organize ourselves in a way with a platform that moves us forward, So, and don't let anybody define your movement or your actions, I've, lived with that throughout my life, It's okay to break the rules for the greater good.
Who else? Let's see.
I'll try to form this in a I'm sorry.
Okay,
Yeah?
okay.
All right. I'll try to form this in a question, but it's going to be more of a statement. So.
A speech.
Okay. All right.
I just. Yeah.
I was a member of the Young Lord. Just by I'm not Young Lord, El Comité. Just by coincidence, there's about 6 of us here. I don't know. We didn't call each other up last night or anything like that. It's by coincidence. And the main reason I came to this activity, because it says here Puerto Rican activism. It didn't say Young Lords activism. Because to be very honest, there have been several activities in recent months for the Young Lords, and I just didn't feel like coming down. You know, because, and this, I really appreciate what you've done, Johanna. Don't take this as disrespect or anything. But if we're gonna hand down history, let's do it right. In my opinion, and I think some of my comrades here would agree with me, the Young Lords were not the movement. The Young Lords were part of the movement. If they were vanguard, if they were leadership, if they were the spearhead, fine. But to my knowledge, there was at least 5 political organizations, Puerto Rican organizations, during the 1970s. And I'll name them for if you want. But my point is, if we're going to hand down history, because as myself, I'm 72 years old, my role now in the movement, the way I see it, is writing a book and handing down my experience and my wisdom. And if we're gonna do that, let's do it right, okay? Again, there were several organizations involved there, and the movement made a lot of mistakes. Okay, I'll never forget one when we went to Washington, D.C. To protest for the freedom of the Nationalist War. There was a gang-like atmosphere between the Young Lords and the Comité. I say both of them. I could never forget standing in front of the White House. There's a park there. If it wasn't time for the buses to leave, there would have been a bit of a gang war. I remember us standing behind Puerto Rico and the Young Lords standing on another side, and we were basically facing each other down. That's one of the mistakes. That gang-like, infantile behavior that we had. And there were several more. The whole thing of being so militant and then turning off the community when we wanted to work with them. There's a lot of mistakes. There's a lot of documents. There's a lot of good stuff that came out of the Comité. You know, I would love, you know, somebody to gather all that stuff around and hand it down, because it was great stuff. One thing, okay, I might be a little biased, but one thing I remember, we put out some great stuff. El Comité put out some very theoretical political stuff that needs to be engaged along with all the other stuff that we're talking about. So my question to you, Johanna, is, and to everybody, in the book, because I'm going to definitely purchase it at the end of the night. In the book, do you mention that there were other groups involved in the movement?
Before you get Johanna, so you can gather your thoughts, Arsenio, I think you're absolutely right. And I think for me, when I opened up today, you know, I acknowledge the presence of this organization. No. It's not about appreciation. If I would have seen somebody here from the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, I would have done it also. Because I think you're absolutely right. We were part of a movement. Wherever we were situated in that, to me, it's not even important at this point in my life. But I think you're absolutely right, and I think that perhaps there should be a forum where all of those organizations come forward and talk about their experiences, their positive experiences, and their lessons.
So, you know what? Clearly, there's a lot that went on in the 60s, because everywhere I go, a mí me queman. No, listen, my book is 431 pages, and I talk about all the organizations. And I had to do that because the Young Lords didn't exist in a vacuum, but ultimately, the Puerto Rican movement and the Young Lords are not part of the narrative of what happened in this country in the 1960s. And so I felt that I needed to do a very thorough job of contextualizing the broader movement and where the Young Lords fit into that. And I definitely do talk about El Comité, but all the other Puerto Rican organizations that preceded the New Left kind of organizations like El Comité and Puerto Rican Student Union, and others, the organizations that essentially provided the arms to the Puerto Rican nationalists, many of which were situated here in New York City. And I'll say this, there were many organizations, and El Comité did phenomenal work around housing, and the legacy of that is still here in New York City. But there was something about the Young Lord style and its character that made it indigenous to the 60s. And you know what that was? Its connection intravenously to the Black movement and the Black Panther Party. And I'm not Puerto Rican, I'm Dominican, and I'm a historian. And objectively, that cannot be denied. That there was something about the Young Lords that helped its generation articulate its condition. And when you do that as a social movement, you capture the imagination of a generation and you will be talked about throughout history. So I want to say that there were many groups, pero no todos somos iguales. And I'm gonna just lay it down because I spent 431 pages talking about this. The Young Lords was the vanguard of the 60s movements for the Puerto Rican movement. That doesn't mean that what El Comité did was not important. And in fact, when the Young Lords went to Puerto Rico, the El Comité held it down for many years. And politically, El Comité was a lot more sophisticated than the Young Lords. But that's not necessarily what that moment called for. And so I'm just being a Young Lords nationalist right now and establishing the history.
I just want to say that in my piece of The Look of Sovereignty, I posed it as a question. Why is it that the Young Lords has captured the imagination and that it has such a central position today? So I didn't take it for granted. I posed it as a question. And apart from what you said, all of which I concur, it told its story to a pretty broad audience. It learned how to use the media in a way that other groups had never learned how to use it. And it produced an archive which people can draw to continue telling that story, right? So as a curator of an archive at Columbia, Arts and Activism Archive, I would very much invite people that are parts of social movements to not throw their archives away, for instance, which happens all the time. Like I'm chasing a lead, and then I get there, and it's like, oh, not a piece of paper left. To do, you mentioned earlier, like oral histories, or that could be a type of project, oral histories that tell the stories so they can be amplified and shared. So I think those are all practices that we can adopt now to keep enriching the incredibly complex story that we still haven't even, we're just starting to tell it.
We have
I just want to jump in and say I really appreciate your question. And as a curator here at the museum, we would love to talk to anyone in the room about objects and images and documents that they have from their work beyond the Young Lords. We have Hiram Maristani's photographs on view that help create this archive, but we want to broaden and keep talking about it. So thank you.
We have time for one more question. I'm not taking any position in this discussion because these people know martial arts. And, yes. Yes.
Hi, good evening. Sincerely appreciate the footprint that the Young Lords have paved. And I do have a question for the curator for the installations upstairs. I briefly walked through. I didn't see coverage on the Black Panthers, and I did not see coverage on the Brown Berets. So I just wanted to circulate back to that. And also with regards to this summer's movement, our Million Man March, our Puerto Rican Million Man March, we ignited movement here at Columbus Circle, and we actually went down to Grand Central Station, and that was part of the diaspora movement. And then we hopped on a plane that evening and went to La Fortaleza. So we would like to have that discussion because this activism has increased. And we are now the product of the Young Lords movement. My mother was a cult member, by the way. But I have several questions. I know that we're pressed for time. You know, we have our groups here, and there's several groups. And within those groups are subgroups like FTP, Take Back the Bronx. My linear focal point is Puerto Rico. Okay, we frequent the island every 4 weeks. Power just got back on Sunday. I got back last Friday. And this has been since Maria. Our work has been before Maria, but of course, and as a reaction to Maria and now the recent earthquakes. We're in a respirator, guys, and the diaspora holds the key. Numbers don't lie. You said 5.3, or it's closer to 6. We're more outside of the island than we are on. And we need to continue to show our presence there, and this is why we take full action. We have the flexibility at times and the availability to get on a plane and show face there. I just marched at the Capitolio. Wanda renuncia is a hashtag that you need to also have on there. So we're looking for unity. We're looking for direction. We are in desperate need of bringing all resources together. And I know that we have it here. You have us grassroots, we have, the historians. We need to take action now, and we're looking to see what can we do now. The depopulation rate continues to increase aggressively. The last 10 years, we had 334,000 people under the age of 30 leave the island, but you have 500 millionaires move into the island because of Act 20 and 22. So we would like to know, how can we bring these resources together now? And also with regards to the debt, we're also present at every debt hearing, whether it's at 500 Pearl Street here in the city or in Haitorrey. We don't see presence there of professionals that could help build legal counsel. We're often the only ones at these hearings out of the whole diaspora. So we're asking for your partnership. We're asking, let's exchange resources. We're demanding that we control our narrative. And the only way that we're doing this is through social media. You know it's being underreported, not being reported at all. So we would like to extend this conversation now that we have this platform that you guys provided, and I commend you for that, but there's so much work that needs to be done, and timing is definitely of the essence, because we're being eradicated. We're being eradicated, that's the truth. And not minimizing the activism here in New York, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but we're not going to have a Puerto Rico to talk about, okay? We have to hold large corporations accountable, politicians. Somos antipolitiquero. I'm going to be very straight up right now because no one has delivered. No one's delivering. AOC could talk a good talk. Nydia could talk a good talk. Where are the deliverables? No more of that old school rhetoric of the promises. We're being eradicated. Timing's of the essence. The depopulation continues to happen. Families are leaving every single day. Yauco is almost a ghost town. Yauco and Ponce are almost ghost towns. What do they think? People could live in tents forever? And yes, the diaspora arrived before any governmental agency. Any governmental agency for Maria, as well as for the earthquakes. Some of us have arrived with £1 million, distributed to 3,000 homes. So the list goes on and on. We arrived before the military, we arrived before Red Cross, and all the governmental agencies. So we're being ignored purposely. Everyone's getting caught up in these political campaigns. Don't believe the hype. We have to save ourselves. So we need to get together, Please, we're asking for this unison, and we need to completely pay attention who is realistically governing the island, and that is La Junta. It doesn't matter who gets elected, Wanda, whoever, it doesn't matter. La Junta controls us. They override our constitution. Thank you. I am Brooklyn Storm in Aruguara. This is Power Malu. We are affiliated with several organizations, not only here in New York City, Diaspora Resistencia in Florida, Los Angeles Boricuas in California. We're coming together as one, so there's not one stamp on it. We are diaspora, and we hold the key. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you for coming. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to Johanna for such a beautiful work. She's gonna be signing the books back there, and so linger for a little bit, I suppose. Okay? Gracias.